Of all the Russian tank storage bases, the 769th is the largest. It was before the war began, and it still is as of our last total count. In that count, the image we used at the time was already 3 months old. So, being the largest, and having to use an older image at the time, we recently saw the opportunity to get a newer and higher resolution one that was just 3 days old at the time, and we jumped on it to see how it's changed. And we found evidence of the most significant drop since the war began. And again, when I say we, HIMARS was absolutely instrumental here with the counting. We counted not only this, but recounted 3 other images at least 2 times each, along with HIMARS counting a few other older images to get a complete picture of the base and how it's changed. Also, to get a better understanding of the base, I spent way too much time making a complete detailed 3D model, complete with every last vehicle in their exact position, building, fences, even light posts. This all allowed us to move around and look at the base from different angles that are not possible from satellite imagery. One thing I noticed clearly when making the model, especially tracing out the security fences, is that the base is actually 3 separate sections. What I call the north section, the south section, which are both used for vehicle storage, and then a separate center section for logistics and supply. And they are all completely sectioned off from each other by a triple layered security fence. The only way to get from one to another is to leave through security, out to the main road, drive, and enter back into the base through security again. Why this is? I don't know. You'd think they'd want to combine everything to make it easier. One reason might be the terrain. The area is mountainous, and even the base is on uneven ground. Another is likely due to the long, strange history. The first Western knowledge of the base is documented in a CIA report from 1964, which was right after the Sino-Soviet split. Because of this, the Soviets were moving a lot of forces east to counter the perceived Chinese threat. The map in the report and the corresponding satellite imagery show massive barracks, but it's changed completely since. In fact, it took me over an hour just to line up these images, because almost no buildings from the 1960s remain today. In the early 2000s, the southern section stored reserve vehicles. The northern section also held vehicles, but in better conditions. Possibly it was holding more active vehicles for units like the 57th Army Corps. And then the very top northern section, where today tanks and BMPs are cramped together, it actually didn't store anything at all and was completely sectioned off. By 2010, we see they've knocked down the fence and began to store vehicles there. And this aligns with the 2008 Russian military reforms, which started in 2009. Before them, the entire Russian military was a nightmare. There were hundreds of units that really only existed on paper. Although, since they had so many vehicles left over from the Soviet era, those units actually were assigned them. They just didn't have the manpower or money to pay for it. So numerous storage depots were built to hold those vehicles. The 2008 reforms greatly reduced the number of units. They shut down many storage bases, like this one here that's completely closed, and then consolidated the remaining ones, like our 769th. So, Russia likely just started throwing vehicles and parking them wherever they'd fit. But this is where things began changing. In 2011, this base and others were completely packed full of tanks. In 2012, they began a large-scale disposal of vehicles. Over 10,000 tanks were to be destroyed. And this is actually where people get the wrong idea that Russia has tens of thousands of tanks still. That information just keeps getting repeated, even though it's based on extremely old data before they destroy the majority of them. And the rate that this base is declining has sped up substantially. From September 2023 to May 2024, it declined by 48. That's 7 months, so on average less than 7 tanks per month. But then, May to September 2024, it's dropped by 79. That's just 4 months, averaging almost 20 per month. So it's recently increased its rate of decline by a factor of 3. You might think, well, maybe they do more work in the summer months and less in the winter because over the winter it's cold. But looking at the previous summer, from April to September 2023, the number of tanks actually grew by 48. The exact reason for this is unknown, and again, both HIMARS and I counted each image multiple times to make sure we didn't screw up somewhere. Unlike some bases, there really aren't any indoor storage garages here. The few that do exist are for maintenance, or collapsing, or a few just small covered shelters. With some storage bases being effectively empty by mid-2023, like the 1295th and even the 111th, it's possible they're consolidating. After all, those are the only 2 bases further east than the 769th, so moving westward to a larger base is a shorter distance to eventually send them to Ukraine if needed. So that's tanks, but this base also holds a pretty large number of other armored fighting vehicles, mostly BMPs. Unlike tanks, their number hasn't changed at all in the last 4 months, still 509. The number has dropped significantly from the pre-war though, when it had 919, so 55% or nearly half today. And those remaining look pretty rough. It's obviously hard to know for sure in satellite imagery, but many appear to be missing turrets, many with the top passenger doors that have been left open for years, exposing the interior to the elements. Here I point out just a few, but you can see there are lots. Some 25 to 50% have visible defects, and that's just from what we can see from satellite imagery. We estimate that there's only about 160 left that could realistically be brought back into service without major work and repairs, likely costing more than they're even worth. And again, a similar situation with the tanks. Nearly half are in horrible condition. Here alone contains the most. These 200 plus tanks have sat here for years and years, virtually untouched. Here they are packed so tightly together that it's impossible for maintenance to have been done. Pick out any single tank and it becomes pretty clear that there's no way they could have ever gotten to it to do any work to it. So, what all this means, when graphed out, here's what we get. The big drops that we see in late 2022 comes from Russia's mobilization. This is where they quickly pulled massive numbers of vehicles to fill newly created units. So those drops are not really reflecting replacements of losses. The bottom red area is what we consider the real zero. Everything below that is pretty much just scrap, and would require much more work to repair than, again, they're even worth. So while they do retain roughly 65 and 55% of their pre-war tanks and BMPs respectively, if we take into account their condition, it's less than 50% for tanks and under 30% for BMPs. The recent rate of tank decline is actually pretty important as it likely reflects more replacements of losses. That first big decline again was the beginning of the war and then mobilization. Then after that it pretty much leveled out, but now suddenly dropped substantially. The BMP numbers, again, we see a major drop for mobilization, but it's pretty much leveled out since. And that could reflect the fact that the remaining vehicles here are in substantially worse condition, and they're already scraping the bottom of the barrel. And even those that do remain for each are extremely old. It's almost exclusively T-62s and BMP-1s. Both began production over 60 years ago. And just think about that. There's been several new generations, each designed, built, and then became obsolete just for another generation to be built in that time frame. So Russia is being increasingly put in a worse position, with significantly less capable vehicles as time goes on. And the decline continues. I got lucky, and in the very bottom left of the satellite image I purchased, you can see about a dozen more tanks being loaded onto trains to be shipped out.